obviously Lars Jakob and I have worked together for some years, so I will try to not repeat what he has already said. As we have told already, that Larvik has different areas, and this is from just a couple of days ago in one of the areas of Larvik that still is dominated by wooden architecture. And this would be in the area for craftsmen, seamen, and workers. And it's a small house that has been built larger in the later years. I'm going to talk about architecture with weight on source materials. And I'm sorry to say my colleague is not here today, but I will try to cover her what she wanted to say as well. What we see here is an imaginative picture of Larvik from the 17th century, but it still bears some truth in it. It's made by a Frenchman, to mention. It was painted around 1685, and by then Larvik already had approximately 800 inhabitants, which is quite many inhabitants to be in Norway. And it was a flourishing pre-industrial coastal city with great success in export of timber and iron. It had also had fortifications shown by this. It didn't look like that. It is just to tell that the city was protected. And with fortifications, it had public services and a commercial network stretching inwards the country, but mostly outwards. It is also well observed that houses were very regularly along the shoreline and partially climbing up the steep sloping hills. Is this one? As Lars Jakob told you about, Larvik was a special city in the Norwegian context. And the city was planned and it was owned by a Danish count, a Danish nobleman, and he was in fact the illegitimate son of the Danish king. And of course, for Norway, it meant quite a bit that he decided to make this his earldom, his county, in 1671. And here you can see a closer look at the area today, which was the former county of Larvik in Jarlsberg. And here you can see Larvik city today. And you can see as well that it's the Skagerrak and it's the European continent at a distance. In urban history, Norway belongs to the outer northern Europe, and of course this had implications for size and complexity of the city, but still Larvik had all the basic features to define the city about 1690. Oh. So the purpose of what I'm going to tell you and this study is to investigate the available archival sources with the intention of utilizing these in a digital reconstructions of the buildings of Larvik at three historical points, 1690, 1770 and 1900. So which archival sources exist, what can they tell us, and how can we use them? A characteristic feature of the absolutist Danish-Norwegian state was the emergence of bureaucracy, which brought forth the written sources which we benefit so greatly from today. And we have two important sources that offer insights into the buildings of Larvik and other physical structures, and they are the land books and the probate records. spent quite a few hours in the archives to document the sources of Larvik's architect history. And what you see here is from a registration done as early as in 1687 and 88. It was a registration of the properties in Larvik city, and these registers are the first we have of the land properties in the town, and they were known at the time as the land books. The land books were the continuation of an old tradition that was reviewed within the autocratic bureaucracy of Denmark and Norway. The purpose of the registration was to establish who was obliged to pay land rent, and into the land book was entered at a minimum the size of every property and the stretch of shoreline, and for most part also the measurements of the actual house and the garden or gardens. In some very few instances, every building on the property had been measured. The properties on the main street Storgatan have been described in most detail, properties in other parts of the town less so. And we also have something which is quite rare as well in Norway. It's a supplementary map, which you can see very poorly, but anyhow, this shows the main parts of the town or the city in the 17th century, which you can perhaps recognize from Lars Jacob's images as well. And the next important source was the probate records. This was a register introduced in Norway around the mid-17th century. In towns, the probate process was administered by the town bailiff and magistrate, and the town clerk writing the probate records and deeds of conveyance. To all intents and purposes, this system remained in practice until the Inheritance Act of 31st of July 1854. Public probate was only mandatory in cases where the descendants next of kin were underage, absent or abroad, or when there was no next of kin. Widow and widowers often received a dispensation, allowing them to reside in the property, or could avoid the probate process if the couple had drawn up a mutual will. The oldest preserved probate records are from 1656. These records are of value because they tell us about the household goods and furniture in the residential building, but sometimes also what was kept in the stable, in the wash house, in the general store, workshop, porch, and so on. And this allows us to indirectly know something about the buildings because the records refers to room as well as the buildings. One problem about these sources are they are not systematic. They were not made for all the properties. They serve primarily as important additional information for us. For the 1767 or 70 reconstruction, this is our most valuable source. It's the general fire insurance policy for buildings. It was established in the 1767, and the institution was governed by the state administration in Copenhagen until 1840. Later it became Norwegian. And the background for its instigation was that the Crown held economic responsibility for compensation after large town fires. Membership in the scheme was compulsory for house owners in towns, and an evaluation was carried out every 10 years, so it's very systematic. An annual tax was levied on every property and went into a selected from upstanding burghers of the town who had to have adequate knowledge of building techniques and be able to write. So we can see one of the pages from this registration here, telling the number of the building, where it is, which ward, the name of the owner, and then comes quite a detailed description of the house. And you can read from it the length and breadth of the building, the floors and the different rooms, building construction, number of windows, foundation, basement, and number of fireplaces. What kind of roofing, whether the house was painted or not. Then follows the side buildings or wings, outbuildings in the same manner. The garden and length of fences and the yard. It is usually described how the buildings are located relative to each other and sometimes in relation to the street. When the first assessment was carried out in Larvik, the buildings were distributed on 5 wards and 317 properties. And all the houses were built from wood. Only 3 houses were in brick. So this is actually from the first protocol of Larvik. You have already seen the map from 1688, and this is a colored version of the same map made by a military called Peter Wilster in, I think, about 1690. And the interesting thing here is that you can see the Danish version of Norwegian topography, with mountains look a bit like clouds. They have almost no mountains in Denmark. And here you see what Lars Jakob talked about, the large residential building and the garden owned by the Count. And here, west of his property, is the town or the city itself. And you can see that the painter has kind of tell us about the gardens here. You can see the gardens, but unfortunately it says nothing about the houses, how the houses looked or how big they were and so on. But we can learn about the streets of the city, and we can also learn about the industries here on the west part and small industrial workers area here far west. This map is from the same area, and you can see here we have all the ground plans, the basic information about the buildings, how they were placed towards the main street, and how they were distributed in this early town landscape from the early 19th century. The reason why we can't use it to, not uncritical it, to reconstruct the city is because of a big fire in 1792, which actually ruined, or all the buildings along the main street burned down, and as well all the buildings here and a bit up this street here. So for these buildings, we have to reconstruct them on the basis of the fire records, the fire assessments, which I showed you. This is the later map, and this is the basic map we have used for the reconstruction of Larvik. It's from 1873-74. And we use it because what we have found out is that for the plots, for the properties, the boundaries, the borders, they are mainly basically the same. as in the 17th century. This is quite extraordinary, we think. For the 1900, we have this excellent map from 1903, and as you can see, all the yellow buildings are wooden buildings, and all the red buildings, like Jacob told you, around the marketplace and the town square, we have the brick buildings, the mason-built buildings, which are marked red. And also all the industrial buildings are now made by brick. So I will now say a bit about the reconstruction of the buildings of Larvik in archival source materials 1690 and 1770. Larvik was a relatively densely built area even in 1690, and it became too demanding for the project to make a reconstruction for all three periods. We therefore chose the historical points 1770 and 1900 only. Of the same reason, we had to concentrate on a smaller area than planned, just because there are so many houses. So what you see here is the area that we have concentrated our reconstruction and the modeling for this area. And as well, this says Herregården, this is the Count's residence, just right east for the city center. Yes. And firstly, this is the area I mentioned where the Count's residence was built. And of course, the city was already there when he came, so he built it just right outside the city to find a place for this enormous garden. It was the largest garden, I think, in Norway in its time. And this building is built from log construction, timber, and it still stands. And it's a part of the museum today. This huge garden no longer exists, but it had so much detailed records on it that Lars Jakob, he made this construction that we have been able to reconstruct it even in the smallest detail. As you can see with the fountain and the hedges and everything. This is the area today. And this is the Count's residence, the timber building. Today, still lying here, is a part of the museum, where, as you can see, the old area for the garden is owned by the municipality, and in the beginning of the 20th century, they built schools. They just removed the garden and they built schools instead. Apart from the archival sources, we also have descriptions of Larvik in the 18th century. And I brought one because I think it's interesting in the scope of this conference. And it's written from a Danish visiting Norway, and he was very impressed of what he saw. And he says, there are timber buildings that have already housed 3 generations, and yet still appear as good as new. This was written in 1790. Paneling is the custom here. An unpaneled house does not last half as long. Paint also preserves the timber. Larvik's inhabitants also deserve praise for their good taste. The most common colors in use are brown, blue-gray, or white with green window frames, which give the town a tidy and clean appearance. There are 400 houses in the town, The terrain is very uneven and steep hills rise up in the middle of the town, on the sides of which fine houses have been built. This is quite a charming description from 1790, and this aquarelle is from 1783, and it just illustrates what he is writing in a good manner. So Larviku showed you this area just some couple of minutes ago, but his picture is some years old already, and this is taken just the other day. And some of you might have noted that this building was yellow in his picture. And because we have done a lot of both archival and we have also studied the construction of the building, it was originally red. It's built by brick, and it's one of the finest buildings in Larvik today, and everybody is proud of it. It's very much thankful to Larviku that this building is preserved so good today. So we can see these houses are still standing, and people in Larvik tend to get more and more proud of their own architecture, and more conscious that this is important for the identity of the people living in Larvik, and as well for tourists coming to our town. But now I want to tell you, this is only an image of how we have worked with the fire assessment descriptions. This is the oldest part, the pictures we just looked at, and this is quite funny to see for me, because I have drawn all these small white clips on paper, and I had to clip them out of paper and to attach it to the old map from 1688. So this is in fact every building that was built in 1767 attached to the map from 1688. And then we have geo-referenced it to today's map, so it's accurate and it's on scale. And what you can see as well is that we have given, thanks to the fire assessments, we can put color. This is pink, but it's red. So this is a red house, and a yellow house, and a blue house, and another blue house, and then a green house. And we also had information, as I told you, about gardens. So here we have, in fact, measured the gardens in scale, and we had as well marked the fences around the gardens. And this is another reconstruction drawing from Larviku in Haug, based on the fire assessment. And these are the buildings in scale and how they actually looked in 1767. And this was the red building I talked about, and you saw this building and this building. They still exist, while many of the other buildings have disappeared during the years. This is the area west of the area that you were just looking upon. This is the main street of Larvik today. And this is our reconstruction of the same area in 1767 in scale. And here we have marked all the houses with timber facades. They are all gone today, but we have been able to place them in the right place. And this is also a reconstruction of this area, in how this area looked in 1767. This is a photo from around, I think, 1900, of what is called the Stenen Award. It's one of the areas in the fire assessment protocol. So it stretches like a triangle, and there is a street here. We will look closer on it in a minute. As you can see from the Frenchmen and from the Danish, they were very occupied with the steep hills in Larvik, with the houses climbing upwards. So you can see the basement of the house will be very tall in this part and very small in this part. This picture was from the beginning of the 20th century, and the area looks quite the same today. But all the outbuildings, most of the outbuildings are gone today, and as well the gardens. So here is a reconstruction of the area in as it would be in 1767. And this area consisted of this main street called Stengaten, Stone Street, because all the pebbles in the street, and small alleys. There was one alley continued westward and towards the city square. And as early as in 1688, Stengaten had 58 plots of properties, while as the number in 1767 was 61. The archival sources, and I guess nobody in Norway today knows that this street has ever been called Reinhold's Alley. And it's quite typical for Larvik, because Reinhold is a name of a man. And we have found out that some of these houses are on the corners, and the person living on the corner gave a name to the alley or the street. But some places in Larvik, it's still there. It's like Schultz's Street, and nobody today knows who Schultze would be, but I know, because I found him in the archival sources. And as well, we found Reinhold. He meant nothing. He was just a craftsman. We know nothing about him, but he gave a name to this street. But then in 1812, the Swedish prince came on a visit to Norway, and he visited, of course, Larvik, the old residential town of the counts. And then this name was called the Princess Street, and it still is. And this is the name that people recognize. And I must tell you that when we go back to 1700, this street was not Reinhold Street, and it was not Princess Street, but it was the back street, because it runs on the back of the main street. But we didn't know until, and nobody knows in Larvik until we found it in the archival sources. And as you can see, this is a very interesting picture even today. Some of these houses still exist, but they are rebuilt. Some of them are brick houses. But you can see that this is, I think, one of the very early, is from 1880 or 1890, I think. And here is the same, this is the same street reconstructed in 1767, and it has been very interesting for us to see how very few houses there would be in this area. It's quite densely built here, but not this part. It's very scarcely built. We don't know, we don't understand why, but it's interesting. But then when we move to the last area, the Torvet, or the town square, or the marketplace area, this is also a rare picture. I think it's from about 1870 or 1880. And even though many of these houses have been renewed, it's structure is the same as you could find in 1767. And some of the houses are also the same as in the 18th century. This area has completely changed today. It's a modern area, so it's been very difficult, but also very interesting to reconstruct it. Every single house with every single room, and to find how the houses were placed in relation to each other, and then to measure up and draw in all the gardens. As you can see, gardens were important in Larvik, and it was important for the household as they could grow vegetables, fruits and berries, and most of them had a cow or even a pig and some hens. So it has been a very lively town. So I have some few minutes, I guess, left, yes, to tell you about materials that should be presented from my colleague, but the materials from 1859 to 1921. And to make the digital reconstruction of Larvik around 1900, we have a rich and diverse set of source materials. In addition to the primary and secondary written sources, there are maps, photographs, films, property registers, development plan drawings, architectural drawings, as well as existing buildings, street environments, and topography. I'll not go through all this, but the main sources, as I have already told you, was the town maps from 1873-74, 1884, and 1903. And then we also have a new land register and other sources to tell us about Larvik at this point. And you have already seen those two maps. In addition are registers, maps, drawings from 1860 and later, archived in the office of the civic engineer, the town planning office, and Larvik Building Council. And these sources add details to the city's development around 1900. In addition to the maps, photographs and films provide invaluable evidence to Larvik around 1900. Several photographers established studios in the town at the end of the 19th centuries, and the cameras became more useful in better-off families. There are therefore a steadily growing number of photographic images of the town, including panoramic views, street views, and images of individual properties. Together with the maps of the period, they offer a solid visual foundation for digital reconstruction of parts of Larvik. As far as it has been possible, the places and dates captured in the images of both collections have been identified. And this is a picture stretching eastwards. It's very dark, but it's interesting because it's, I think it's from as early as 1870s. And it gives us information about how the structure of the town has been altered in the 1850s and 60s. And I think it's too dark. This is the harbor at the end of the 19th century, and you can see this very lively coastal town of Larvik with these great houses for to house goods coming from the ships. They have all disappeared today, but thanks for the maps and these photographs, we are able to reconstruct it, and you will recognize this building as well. And here are the piers with all the ships coming and going from Larvik. And you have already seen this one. This would be from a wooden building. And this is from the main street showing the wooden buildings after they were rebuilt after the fire of 1792. And this is one of the more humble buildings of Larvik, it has been altered, but it's still there. It's the same size, it's the same structure, it's the same building today. So it is hoped that through a process of georeferencing the historical maps and collating the written sources, it will have a good basis for a digital reconstruction.